So today we have a one-word lesson, a one-word topic. But it's more than a word. In fact, I believe it should be, for every one of us, the major goal of our lives. I became mindful of this word in the last 2 or 3 months because frequently when we would go to the Table Rock, there's a meeting room up at the second floor. It has whiteboards on 2 or 3 of the walls where the pastors meet a lot and the elders meet, and it's just a general room that's used. Many times over the last couple months when we go there, this word is written there, and usually in capital letters. That room is where a lot of discussions and prayers had about how should the church be, what should it be thinking about, what should we focus on, and this word keeps appearing. It's a powerful word. Based on the song we just sang, who would hazard a guess as to what the word is? Abide. Very good. Very good. Abide. Abide is an old word. If you use the Authorized King James Version, which all the time, because I'm older than dirt, all the time I was a child, that was the Bible there was, unless you used the New Revised Standard or American Standard. There were only a few to choose from, right? Now we have lots of translations. But if you grew up on that old King James Version, which was written back in 1611, I think, translated, the word abide appears in there over 100 times because it was a common word for hundreds and hundreds of years in the English language to describe a situation. Now, if you use one of those later versions like the New American Standard or Revised Standard, you'd only find abide about 50 times in that Bible. But if you're in what I suspect is the larger group, like this one, you use the NIV that was published in the 70s or the New Living Translation published in the 90s. How many of you use something like that, a fairly recent translation? Well, let's all turn and we'll find that the word abide is not in your Bible at all. Just not there. So, we have a problem, right? Did God change His mind? No, He did not. But we know that words change over time, right? And the word abide is no longer commonly used in our world. Now, we can think of a lot of words whose usage has changed. For example, this morning I was talking to some guys. Any of you talked to some guys this morning? Okay. When I say guy, you think of what? A male person in America, right? Well, up until probably 80 or 90 years ago, the word guy would have meant a frightful, evil person. It comes, it seems, from back around 1605, a long time ago, about the time of the King James Version. A group of people really were unhappy with Parliament, their version of Congress. We will not have a show of hands about our opinion of Congress. We will not do that. But here's what people in the past have done when they felt that way. This group was very unhappy, and their ringleader was a guy named Guy Fawkes. And they came up with a plan whereby they could blow Parliament up while everybody was in it. Luckily, they didn't pull it off. They got caught. It didn't happen. But it incensed the public, and Mr. Guy Fawkes became the ringleader for that, and he was the one that everybody hated. He got all the publicity. And they would burn him in effigy, and they would talk about the guy, and the word guy came to mean a very evil criminal person. And that's what it meant. Until somehow, over the years, it became the opposite. Any kind of male person. So, words change. But the underlying meaning of whatever those words were doesn't change. And the same is true of abide. So, I don't usually do it. I go to the internet. But this time I thought, well, I'll actually get my dictionary. So it took a while, but I found my Webster's Collegiate Dictionary, and I've had this since my last year in high school when I got it as a gift. Well, I opened it up, and with some dismay, I noticed that it was now almost 50 years old. So, of course, something of that age had the definition of abide in it. And here's what it says. First of all, it says that it's a verb. It's an action word. If you're going to abide, you have to be doing something. And then it's a word that has a lot of staying power in it. It has several meanings: to wait for, to endure without yielding, to withstand, to bear patiently, to tolerate, to accept without objection, to remain stable or fixed, or continue in a place. So it's a pretty powerful word. It shows that once I'm at a place, I'm going to stay there. It shows a sticking with it. It shows a hanging in there. So I think a part of me feels a little bit of a loss when I go through my NIV, and what I find is the word stay. or the word remain instead of the word abide. Stay is a good word. Remain is a good word, but I'm not sure it's as tenacious as abide. So when I'm singing the song, asking God to stay with me, I don't want him to just stay till he has a better option. I want him to be determined about it, right? And that's what the word abide dictates. However, there's other places in the word that talks about how we should abide in God. And that's the main point of our lesson today. Abide with God is the key thing we need to be determined about in our own lives. Because from that will flow every aspect of what else happens in our lives. We can only abide in one place at a time, it seems to me. Whatever our focus of attention, whatever our key concern, that is what will hold our energies. And we're being asked as believers to abide, to focus, to tenaciously stay with our relationship to God. You know that, but it's powerful. And we're going to talk about it because it's hard to do. Now, Abide With Me was possibly an unknown song to some of you. If you're younger or if you'd worship in a place where that song wasn't used, to many of us who are, shall we say, a little more mature, we knew the song, we'd heard it before, and it's something we'd known many times. Well, it comes from a very long time ago. It was written in 1847 by a British pastor. The man lived in Devonshire, England. His name was Henry Lyte, L-Y-T-E. And there's a history to this song. Henry Lyte had had a long period of ministry in this church in Devonshire, and now he had a serious disease that had no cure in that time. He had tuberculosis. It had gotten to be pretty serious. And this particular day was the last time he would ever give a sermon to this congregation. It was the end of his career, the end of his work life. This was the swan song. As he was preparing for his sermon, he was interrupted and compelled to write this song, Abide With Me. No doubt drawing from his own inner turmoils and the situations he was having of facing the end of his life. It has a lot of verses that aren't usually in a hymn book, if you're familiar with the song. But in your handout, there's a half page that looks like this. If you want to take a moment to get it, all 9 verses that Pastor Lyte wrote are there. We won't read them now because time doesn't allow, but I really encourage you to take 3 or 4 minutes of your time today and as thoughtfully as you can, read these verses. Let it run over the hymn, the tune in your mind. No one will know if you can or can't sing. You'll know. But run through those words as the song goes and look at what he's actually saying. And he is beseeching God from a number of different directions to stay with him. We get the sense that Pastor Lyte, like all of us, has gone through his life and done his work and been involved in the things he's involved in, and day passes into day, and he's living. Now he comes to a time, and very abruptly, he's no longer able to do that anymore. He is looking at a dramatic change. He's looking at a change of his profession, retirement, if you will. Well, that's a dramatic change. But it's not as dramatic as the change of death, which he is knowing that he is facing. Now, we don't think about death a lot in our society. We know that everybody does it, but I believe the typical person just thinks, well, it probably won't happen to me today, and that's where we stop. But death is very real, is it not? Every person will die. It's the way the system is set up. And it seems that for many of us, death is viewed as the end and a deep tragedy. But for those of us who are believers in Christ, what is it really? It's not that at all. It's the end of this training period of life where we've had to deal with stuff, and it's the entry to the most glorious, undescribably positive thing that we can imagine, and it's ours for free. Paradise forever with God. There'll be no boss to yell at you. There'll be no IRS checks to send. You can eat whatever you want, and you won't gain an ounce. I'm convinced of it. Whatever we can think of about heaven will be positive. Whatever we can think about in the future where we are living in the presence of God, and He's not just a presence that we know in our minds. He's a presence who's physically there. We see the face of Jesus. We are there with our loved ones. We are in paradise. So why we fear death is a mystery to me. It's puzzling, but we do. Pastor Light, after years of encouraging people how to live, and no doubt he had given a lot of wonderful sermons about God's always here and we're in the presence of God and we must do this and we must do that because he was a good pastor, I'm sure. It seems to have moved from his intellect down to his emotional center if we read the words of this hymn. He is begging God to stay with him now as he goes through the last part of his life, as he goes through his passing. And he's asking God, if you read all these verses, not to remember the times when he was younger, when he failed and wandered off, and not to do this and not to do that, but look at me now. Remember your promises to me. He's already decided that he's not going to wander off because he knows at this point that God is all he's got. He's probably like you. He had lived most of his life, and he couldn't control everything that went on, but he could decide, will I live in this house or that? Will I say this to my wife or that? Will I work at this place or that? He had some control and he had some measure of power in his life. We all have that, don't we? To some extent. Well, now he knows that he's about to go into the next realm. He knows nothing about it. He's never been there, and he certainly has no power or influence to control what happens to him there. But who does? God. He believes from his value system that God is not only controlling this world, but in the next. So he is beseeching God to keep the promises he's made, to keep Mr. Light safe, to stay with him and protect him as God has always promised he would do. We have the same promises from God, and we have to deal with that as well. We want to claim the promises of God, but God expects us to abide with him as well. So, when Pastor Light was writing these words, his Bible language would have been the Bible of King James, correct? So when he's thinking about what he wants God to do, his word for it was not stay or remain, it was abide. So that's the concept we're attaching to. We can use whatever word we want, but we want to focus as believers on God's promises to be with us always and his continued request and requirements that we reciprocate by focusing and being with him. It takes two people to abide, and we're one of them. So, the core thought for us today, we need to purposefully, intentionally abide and stay and be centered in the being of God. It takes action. Remember, abide is an action word. We can't just casually address that issue. We can't just think of it once in a while. If we're going to abide successfully with God, it will take a significant focus and a key intentional process on our behalf. But God has promised, and Jesus has promised, that they are always with us. Jesus, in several places in the New Testament, then asks us to reciprocate and abide with him. And from that, we know the relationship that we should have. It says in Galatians 3, which we're not going to read, that as many of us as have put on Christ, as have been baptized with him, have put on Christ as a garment. Now, how many of you did that this morning? Put on a garment. Some of you are just too lazy to raise your hands, aren't you? Because no one's naked here. Now, there's that moment when you get out of the shower or whatever and you're in the closet, maybe you're in a crowd, maybe you're by yourself. Don't share any of that with us. But you're there and you're unclothed, and then you pick out this shirt and those pants and you put them on, and now you look different, right? You are now covered. You are now encased. You are now wrapped up in something that you weren't before. You look different and you feel different because you are clothed. So when it tells us in Galatians that we have been clothed with Jesus, it means we're different. And we are, in fact, abiding with him at that moment. We have promises from both God and Christ, who are actually the same being, that they will stay with us. Hebrews 13, 5 through 6. Let's read that quickly. Hebrews 13. Keep your lives free from the love of money and be content with what you have, because God has said, never will I leave you. Never will I forsake you. So we say with confidence, the Lord is my helper. I will not be afraid. What can mere mortals do to me? Now that's a powerful verse, isn't it? God of the universe speaks from His lips, I will never forsake you. I will never leave you. I feel pretty good about that. That's a pretty great situation. Then the writer of Hebrews says, so that gives me the ability to say, I don't have to be afraid of anything in this world, because all this world has is other mortals like me, and what can they do to me? Well, let's reflect on that a minute. They can kill you. They can rob you. They can put you in prison. Mortals can do a lot of things to you. But the point here is, I don't really care what mortals can do, because eventually I know that wherever I am, whatever my situation, whatever the process I'm involved in, God is there with me. I'm not alone, and only good can come at the end. So it doesn't mean that we won't have sadness in life. It's maybe the answer to why bad things happen to good people. All the books written about that. God doesn't say, follow me and things will be a bed of roses. What does Jesus Christ say in the Sermon on the Mount? It's a very distressing verse, and I actually went to my Bible and cut it out because I don't like it. But I remember it. It says, in this world, you will, what is it? Have trouble. Well, gee, thanks, Jesus. That's great. But you know what it says in Hebrews 12? He's explaining, the writer of Hebrews, and we don't know his name, but he's explaining that God intentionally uses the things that happen to us in our lives. Perhaps He allows them, perhaps He causes them, but He uses the events of our lives to make us better, to help us become stronger, to help us endure and persevere and develop the things He lists elsewhere, the fruits of the Spirit, kindness and patience and perseverance and long-suffering and love. Now, why would God do those things? God would do those things because His point of view is different than ours. Okay? I have a pen here. Imagine, this is a silly illustration, but maybe it'll help you. Imagine that I take my pen and I go right over here at the wall and I just start walking around the wall and I'm making a mark. Now, I guarantee that would lead to discussions with the custodial staff later if we did that. But imagine that I do this, and I go all the way around the room. Turn around, look how big the room is. I walk all the way around. It would take a while. I would probably run out of ink. But what I'm doing there is we then agree that that line I have drawn represents the length of your total life in eternity, right? Now, it doesn't. No line can be that long. Eternity means there's no end. So that's a hard thing to conceive of, but just imagine that that represents the concept. And then I take this same pen and I go over to the wall, and just above that line, I do this. I make one dot. Can you see the dot? No. But that dot, in the words of God, is your current physical life compared to the time of eternity. He doesn't use ink pens in his illustration. He says it's a vapor. You know, you make tea sometimes, you boil stuff on the stove, there's gas coming up off the top of the water vapor. How long is it there? A second, maybe two. So God's saying the relative position of this lifetime, which is all we know, that seems so long and difficult, is just nothing compared to what He's got in store for us. But what we do here in this brief period determines how that part will go. So He asks us for this brief period of time to abide, to deal with the issues of life, to respond in kindness when people are mean to us, to respond in love when we incur difficulty, to respond in patience when we have frustration, to do all the things that He wants us to do. And why would He do that? He would do that because at the end of our little dot, when we cross out of the dot back into the line of eternity, which is what Pastor Light was about to do, we are then looking at how will I be for eternity and where will I live? Well, God's plan is that we live at His house, right? If God is telling the truth, if Jesus speaks words that aren't a lie, He says, my Father has already prepared your rooms in His mansion. If you read in Revelations about heaven, it's amazingly big and huge and enormous. I'm an accountant, so one time I did a bunch of math. You could have, I don't know, several billion apartments that were like 3,000 square feet each in this place. So you'll come out all right when you get to heaven. You won't live in a tent. You'll have a good situation. You will have perfection at every turn. But you're going to be the guest of God. Now, how many of you, when you're talking to a spouse or a friend, you think, let's have a dinner party. You make a list of all the people who annoy you. And you invite them, right? No. Who do you invite to spend time in your home? People you like. People that share your personality. People that care and think like you do, right? That's what God's doing. He's saying, I want you to come. But when you're there, I want it to be a positive experience. Let's mold ourselves to be like each other. I got an idea. He says, why don't you be more like me? And that's what lifetime is about. That's why we have the situations of what we're in. And sometimes it's very hard. But we have to, through it, abide. So, when we read this text that was up here, Hebrews 13, verse 6, here's the key thing. Are we strong enough in our faith with Jesus? Do we believe in the confidence of God? Do we have enough faith to believe that God was not lying to us? And when He says, I am with you always, that He really meant it. Because if He really did, that's how we have the ability to say with confidence, what can mortals do to me? Agreed? So my challenge to you would be, if you're comfortable with that, or even if you're not, let's say aloud verse 6. Let's say that because of what God has said, I'm willing to make the commitment in verse 6. Put that up if you would. Let's read it together. So we say with confidence. Oh, stop. Who heard any confidence in that? Don't say it if it's not okay, but it's something to pray about. If you can say it, let's do it. So we say with confidence, the Lord is my helper. I will not be afraid. What can mere mortals do to me? Excellent. Excellent. And now the bad news is we got to go do it. So, God gave us His promise. I'll be with you always. Jesus was the man who came to earth in the form. He was God in man's form. He was part of the plan to bring us into salvation. He was the reason we can have God say to us, I'm with you always, right? Because it was what Jesus did to give Himself and to provide the grace of God to us through His own death that we can have a chance to be with God. Because left on our own, we're too sinful and God cannot abide sin. So that's theology for another day. But we owe our relationship and our possibility to abide with God to Jesus Christ. We know about Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the books that explain all the things He did. Then the apostles write all these books later to explain how we deal with that. That's what our whole New Testament is. But Jesus has come now to the end of His ministry. He has lived, He has taught, He has been crucified, He has been dead 3 days, He has come back to life, and now all His apostles are in a huge turmoil, and they're talking about it. The scene in the text we're about to look at is Jesus has taught them all the things He's going to teach, and now He's in a field somewhere with His apostles, all except the one who was a criminal. All the other apostles are there, disciples, and He's given them the very last words He's ever going to speak on earth. He's down to the final, 60 seconds to give instructions to these people who are supposed to go out and launch salvation to the world in His name. So, with that, we hear the last words of Jesus, and let's go to Matthew 28, where they are. Now, we left out a few of the words in this just to save some time, but Matthew 28, verse 18, we're going to read it on the screen. Jesus is saying this, His last words, He came to them and said, all authority. So first he establishes himself as the being that's in charge of everything, everywhere. All authority has been given to me. Therefore go, make disciples, baptize, and teach. He gave them their instructions, what they're supposed to do. His last words on earth are, let's read it together. And surely I am with you always to the very end of the age. Does that sound like a promise to abide? It does. God and Jesus Christ are on record as giving their word to be with us at every moment of every time. So, Jesus then goes and he teaches. We hear teachings from our apostles. We go about trying to live in relationship with God. There's many teachings in the New Testament about how we abide with God, what it means. Probably the most common and easily understood, we're not going to look at it now, but you can make note of it for another time, is in John 15, where Jesus just says simply, I am the vine and you are the branches. His point being there that he represents the big stalk that gets really, really old and really, really thick and comes up to support a grape plant. Grapes were a huge crop in Palestine where he lived, and now they are in our valley too, so maybe we can relate to that. But he's saying that every one of his believers is one of the little branches that grows off the vine. But he makes the point not to confuse them as to who they are, but to tell them how they should be. He says, I am the vine, which is the source of everything that you have to have if you're a grape plant. You will flourish if you abide in me, which he says means to remain hooked to the vine and draw all your sustenance from that. If you're not hooked there, if you don't abide, you become worthless and you're worthy only to be cut off and burned. I had a wonderful video to show you about somebody trimming grapevines. It was very instructional, but the talk is already too long, so we won't get to see it. But the concept is powerful. Would you agree? We can do whatever we want in life. We have all kinds of liberties and freedoms. But Jesus says, I have given my promise to be with you always. God says, I am here for you without fail. You are my guest forever in my home. But to do that, to receive these presents from God, we will have to choose to stay in relationship with Christ and God. And it's a daily choice. Sometimes the choices are easy. Sometimes the choices are extremely difficult. But it's a choice that we continually have to make. Will I abide? But we should always have, at the risk of being ominous, I don't mean to be, we should always have in the back of our mind that Jesus Christ will never force us to stay in relationship. He has done everything conceivable to save us. But then we get to choose if we want to be saved. Would you agree? So our choice every hour of every day is, am I going to choose to remain united and trusting and in confidence with God? Or am I going to wander down this way and do what I need to do? Am I going to believe that even though I loved this person and I've cared for them and I've watched them be ill all this time and now they have died, that that's not a reason to curse God? God could have saved them. Yes, He could have. But He didn't. No, He didn't. Why not? It wasn't His will. Because everyone comes to the end of life. Everyone has events and situations. And maybe they went through theirs so that you could benefit as well and learn something. Now that's hard. Parts of abiding is very difficult. Jesus says the way that leads to destruction is pretty broad, and a lot of people wander down that way, right? The way that leads to eternity with me, another way to say that is for the people who successfully, continually abide through their entire lifetimes, it's a pretty small path because it's hard. But my gosh, how much are you willing to give for an endless line of perfection? We can do it. But we get to choose every day. Will I abide? Will I stay? Will I be there? Will I be in a place where God can, in fact, honor me? For us to do that well, I think we have to have a clear understanding of who God is. I think we have to be very clear that God is not going to wander off. That when Pastor Light wrote his sermon and he was begging God to be sure you keep your promise, he didn't need to say that. But it was his way of expressing what he was relying on. Would you agree? So, we need to know that we are committed to abiding with God, because God will not fail. Jesus was not making it up. He will not change his mind. He will be there. It's whether or not we choose to accept, and we choose to engage, and we choose to choose the way of God versus what our neighbor says we should do, or what our son says we should do, or what our friend says we should do that is contrary to what God would prefer. And that will take action. Abide is an action word. And we have to decide every day, is my comfort or my personal choices in this pinpoint more important than the line around the wall? I think in a silly and very shallow way, that's the way we decide if we will abide or not. However, I do not mean to misrepresent the difficulty of abiding. Jesus came and spent years living on earth so he would know what it's like. It says that he is at the right hand of God now, interceding for God with us. I imagine sometimes Jesus says, well, God, it just seems different when you're there. I imagine sometimes God says, why would they have done that? And Jesus says, well, it just is not the same when you're there and you're a person. I don't know how it works, but I know that God cares, that Jesus cares, and they understand the process. And yet, there are still processes and ways that we have to be if we will abide. One of the issues I think that makes abiding difficult is that I have every confidence that Jesus is real. We will not ask for a show of hands, but I know you do too. However, that is an intellectual concept. I have never seen his photo. I have never watched a video of him. I have never heard him speak. And yet, when I'm in the mechanic shop, having had my car towed, and the man is explaining to me the transmission is dead and it's going to cost $4,000, I can see that guy, right? I can see the car. I can see the tow truck that's just now driving away. And at the time he's saying that's $4,000, I'm flicking back to my bank account that has $47 in it. Have we been there? Somehow that's really real, right? Well, God, couldn't you have fixed this transmission? God says, no, I'm not in the Auto Workers Union. We think those things, don't we? Why does that happen in life? And I'm not trying to make a joke. I'm trying to be real. We're real people. We have issues and struggles in life. Part of them just are. They're part of being a human. Hebrews explains that they have a purpose if we will use them properly. But through it all, God is always there, and we will overcome. To he who perseveres will be given, you remember this? A crown of life. So the big long line around the wall, once you get past the dot of this lifetime, comes if you persevered inside the dot. That's what we're trying to do. So we're not saying that abiding is easy, but we're saying that it's possible, and it takes action. So, with that in mind, we move forward. I think the final key to you being able to decide that you can abide and do it successfully is if you believe that God is who he says he is. Now, you can believe that God tells the truth and still not like God very much. I know some people that I believe will always tell the truth, but I don't like them. They're honest, but their honesty is used to maim and hurt and extract and manipulate people. God doesn't do that. I think whether or not we can abide determines in a large part on our concept of the nature of God. God describes himself as being love and kindness and concern. And that's the God I would like to hear. Now, He also has unlimited power and complete control of everything. So there's really not much God can't do, right? If He chooses to. But He chooses to wrap it in love and care for our benefit. However, there are people in life who, when they undergo a difficult time or a loss or a significant problem that they believe God could have fixed, and they decide God should have fixed it, then they turned their concern to God into anger and resentment because God didn't do just what they needed at the time as they perceived need. Would you agree? That happens to us. If we don't think God is truly loving at His heart and His nature, then we can fall prey to that. And believe you me, Satan will be in your ear whispering every time, a good God would never let that happen. We have to be mindful. We have to be clear about who it is we're serving and that God truly is love and power and goodness. We have to have this final attitude, I believe. It's my opinion that the first verse of Abide with me, fast falls the eventide, the darkness deepens, Lord with me abide. I believe probably Pastor Light had this verse, Luke 24, verse 28 in mind when he read it. Let's look at that text. Luke 24. The scene here is Jesus has died, He's been raised, and now He's into that period of time where He's appearing to various disciples and trying to convince them that this impossible really has happened. And two of His believers are walking along the road, and they're in turmoil. The last few days, no one's ever died and come back to life and all these things. They're talking about it, and they're joined by a stranger they don't recognize, but they walk along the road. The stranger is Jesus, but He doesn't let them know He's Jesus. He tells them all these things, and they're having a wonderful time, and the time goes so quickly. And all at once, they're where they were going to be. And they drew nigh unto the village, whither they went, and He made as though He would have gone further. This is the King James Version. But they constrained Him, saying, Abide with us. For it's toward evening, and the day is far spent. And He went in to tarry with them. Jesus is coming along. He's glad to have an interchange with these people. They make the time go very fast because they're deeply interested in what He's saying and His wonderful company. And the long trip they have, passed in an instant. So now the day is ended, and it didn't take long. The analogy in that text is the day is our lives. Do you sometimes look back and think, now when did that happen? It was last year. No, it was 6 years ago when I saw that person last. Do you have that experience? Life passes at a blur, and yet it seems to be slow, one day at a time. But we're very interested in our own lives, and it goes quickly, and we pay close attention, and it just hurries by. So pretty soon, we'll be like Pastor Light. We will be at the end of our day, and twilight will be falling, and it won't have seemed long, but we'll be there. We want to have abided with Jesus. So notice what happens. They say to Him, as He does not presume that He's invited. Do you see that? He planned to keep on walking, but they have to say to Him, no, stop, please, come in and be where we are. And did He? Yes. Will He every time? Yes. Will Jesus ever knock on the door of your heart and say, let me in, I demand it. You are messing things up. I'm here to clean up the shop. No, not once. He will only come at our invitation, and then He will stay as long as we'll allow and do everything He can. We are in control of whether or not we will abide. But it won't take long till we have to decide that. So it's important that we abide. We can live this life in any number of ways, but if we can live in the way that God wants us to live, where we're abiding constantly, the result will be good in this life and wonderful in the next. It will not be easy, but it's possible, and it's worth it. We started our time today, and you've listened so well, I appreciate it so much, with a very old hymn about a very important concept. We're 170 years down the flow of time from that hymn. So I would ask, if you don't mind, that we close our thoughts and that you focus as much as you're willing on the hymn, on the words of the next hymn we're going to listen to. It was written maybe 10 or 11 years ago by a very modern songwriter. But I believe he's trying to explain to us how we can order our lives to effectively abide with Jesus. And as we go through this song, I think it's very well written. I weep just about every time I hear it, so forgive me if I do. But as we listen to this song, focus on what he's suggesting. And he's suggesting that the way we abide is that whatever our situation is in life and whatever we feel, that we give that to Jesus. Because it says to us in Colossians, do all that you do as unto the Lord. Our goal in abiding is to take the the intellectual knowledge we have where God says, I will never forsake you. Jesus says, I am with you always. Those are statements of fact. The challenge each of us has and the invitation I give to you is to think about how can I take that knowledge from my mind that that's a fact and move it right down here to this place where my feelings are. Now, why do I point to this spot right here? This is the spot, easy for me to say, that if I realized that on my 42nd anniversary I had forgotten it because it was a week ago, I would get this queasy feeling at this feet right here. This is the spot where when I'm late to somewhere and I'm driving down the road and I'm not thinking about my driving, and all at once I see flashing lights and I look down and I surely am 20 miles over the speed limit, this is the spot that lets me know you have messed up. Do you have such a spot? This is the spot that decides how I feel about things, and frequently it determines how I respond to the environment I'm in. We want to move our intellectual knowledge about Jesus down to where our emotions are, the things that drive how we live and behave. The words of this song are on the back of the handout you have if you want to follow along.
Weak and wounded sinner, lost and left to die. Oh, raise your head, for love is passing by. Come to Jesus, come to Jesus, come to Jesus and live. Now your burden's lifted and carried far away, and precious blood has washed away the stain. So sing to Jesus, sing to Jesus, sing to Jesus and live. And like a newborn baby, don't be afraid to crawl. And remember when you walk, sometimes we fall. So fall on Jesus, fall on Jesus, fall on Jesus and live. Sometimes the way is lonely and steep and filled with pain. So if your sky is dark and pours the rain, then cry to Jesus, cry to Jesus, cry to Jesus and live. Oh, and when the love spills over and music fills the night, and when you can't contain your joy inside, then dance for Jesus, dance for Jesus, dance for Jesus, and live. And with your final heartbeat, kiss the world goodbye. Then go in peace and laugh on glory's side, and fly to Jesus, fly to Jesus, fly to Jesus, and live. Fly to Jesus, fly to Jesus, fly to Jesus, and live.